part 2 of the era of good feelings. So the Supreme Court is going to be held by Federalist control. It's going to be John Marshall. He's appointed to the Supreme Court in 1799, 1800, and he becomes Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he's a Federalist, and he's going to make quite a few extremely important rulings that will lay the foundation for this nation as far as how we interpret certain laws. So the first one we've already talked about in our notes. It was the 1803 Marbury versus Madison case under Thomas Jefferson's administration. So you might want to go back and look at that one, but I think there's a summary here of it. So just remember, it establishes judicial review. The next one we're going to talk about here would be McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819. What happens here is the state of Maryland levies a heavy tax on the branch of the National Bank in Maryland. And what the state of Maryland was hoping to do was they were hoping to tax the bank out of business, and it's federally owned. So as you see, this essentially overturns a federal law. So this case is important because is state law more important than federal law? Does state law supersede federal law? So the ruling here ruled for the federal government, and it said it extended the federal government's authority over state authority. In other words, federal law is superior to state law. It declared the National Bank was constitutional because they had always thought the bank was on the fringes of being constitutional or not. The Supreme Court said, by all means, the National Bank is constitutional. It upheld implied powers because it saw the bank as being constitutional. And the big thing here that you need to know is states cannot tax the federal government. So that means, like, if there's federal land, if there's federal government buildings or whatever, the state of North Carolina cannot tax them. Okay, but the federal government can tax them, but not the states. So we need to know that. Gibbs versus Ogden. What happens here in 1820? You have two partners in the steamboat business, and one had a state charter giving him exclusive rights to the route from New York to New Jersey, and the other partner had a federal charter. It's the same route. So they both, between the two of these men, they both cornered the market on this route, and they got charters for the same route, one from the state, one from the federal government. So the Supreme Court, and what happens is these partners break up, and one wants to go his own way. It's actually kind of an interesting story, but what you need to know is the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the federal charter. This establishes federal authority over interstate trade. It's in the Constitution that Congress has that power, but this court case basically establishes that authority. So this one, also interesting, and it happens in 1918. This case dealt with the application of a contract clause, or the contract clause of the United States Constitution, to private corporations. That's what you might want to know. It deals with private corporations. The case arose when the president of Dartmouth College was disposed or fired by the trustees, leading the New Hampshire legislature attempting to force the college to become a public institution. It was private, thereby placing the ability to appoint trustees in the hands of the governor of New Hampshire and not the private sector, not the way they had been doing it. The Supreme Court upheld the sanctity of the original charter of the college, which predated the creation of the state of New Hampshire. The decision settled the nature of public versus private charters and resulted in the rise of the American Business Corporation. You need to underline that. And it gave rise to American free enterprise system. This ruling limited the power of states to interfere with private charters. It protects private charters from government interference. Guys, we have 250 major corporations today. This is why. Because of this right here, the government does not interfere with these private charters. What do all corporations have to have, and businesses have to incorporate? They have to have a charter. You get it from your state. So anyway, make sure you know that. That's a big case as far as business is concerned early on. So we talked about Marbury versus Madison with Thomas Jefferson, but establishes judicial review. McCulloch versus Maryland, there's two things. They that it establishes. Here's Gibbs versus Ogden and Dartmouth College. So make sure you know these. There are 4 very important cases, and all ruled on by the John Marshall courts. And he's going to rule on more. We're going to talk about him a little. All right, so we're going to get into foreign. Here we go. We're going to get into foreign affairs and nationalism. John Quincy Adams, he's a bulldog among spaniels, Secretary of State under James Monroe. And he sets basically, it seems to be the pathway to the presidency. He's arguably the greatest Secretary of State we've ever had. The only other one I can throw up there to you would probably be Lincoln's Secretary of State, William Seward. But this gentleman right here definitely proves to be a worthy Secretary of State. So if you think about it, you got Thomas Jefferson served as Secretary of State, became president. Then you have James Madison served as Secretary of State under Jefferson. He became president. Then you have James Monroe served as Secretary of State under James Madison. He became president. So John Quincy Adams is the Secretary of State under James Monroe, and he's very skilled. So some of his accomplishments here. The Rush-Bagot Agreement. The U.S. and Great Britain agreed to a naval disarmament of the Great Lakes in 1817. You need to know that, and it exists to this day. Convention of 1818. It proposes a fixed boundary line between the U.S. and Canada at the 49th parallel. What is our northern parallel between the U.S. and Canada today? Think about it for a minute. You got it. It's the 49th parallel. Joint occupation of the Oregon Territory. The Oregon Territory is a lot bigger than you think. It covers most of the western part of Canada and the Vancouver area and what is today modern-day Washington State, Oregon, and part of Northern California. So it's a big tract of land. Put a star by this one. The Adams-Onis Treaty. General Andrew Jackson, he was sent down to Florida to stop the Seminole raids in what is today Alabama, that area, Georgia. Andrew Jackson didn't really stay where he needed to stay. He invaded Florida and creates a worldwide mess. He seizes land in Florida. He kills the Seminoles. He starts the Seminole War. All of this good stuff. So John Quincy Adams is sent in to kind of like let's make peace with Spain. And Louis de Onis is sent from Spain over to, basically berate us and say, like, how could we do this and all that good stuff. But what ends up happening is we purchased Florida in 1819 for $5 million. The U.S. agreed to give up claims in Texas for now, and it sets the western boundary of the U.S. So we get a firm western boundary set, and we get Florida for $5 million. If you want, here's a video on it. These underlines here, they're pretty good little short videos for you. If you look, here's what we get. We get Florida, and look at where Florida extends to back then. And then you look at this line here. This is our boundary line. Okay, this is our boundary line, our boundary line with Mexico and the western boundary. So that's a big deal. The Monroe Doctrine. Make sure you know the Monroe Doctrine. This is huge. Okay, it's referred to as America's self-defense doctrine. What foreign policy principles are established in this doctrine? You need to know. What warning is given to the European countries, and what would the U.S. do if the warning is not heeded, are all in this document. Which, by the way, this document was not written by James Monroe. Take a guess as who wrote this foreign policy document. Yep, that's right, John Quincy Adams. So, events that led to the Monroe Doctrine. In 1809, Spanish colonies rebel. Spain ends up losing most of their American colonies. You get the Quadruple Alliance set up by Britain, Austria, Prussia, Russia, and later on France to keep these rebellions down over here in the Caribbean. 1822, the Alliance wanted to help Spain regained control of their colonies they had lost in 1809. Britain objected, and the reason why is because money. They were making a lot of money off of free trade with those colonies, those former colonies. In 1823, Britain wanted the U.S. to join them to help keep the Latin countries free, the Latin American countries free. Also, Russia's moving into the Oregon Territory. Keep an eye on Russia. They're over there in Oregon. John Quincy Adams advised against working with Britain, and he said, why? We may be viewed as Britain's junior partner if we work with them. So we need to do something ourselves. And so, in other words, we need to make our own way. We're not anybody's partner. So he writes the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine basically says the Western Hemisphere is closed to further colonization. This is a huge accomplishment to lay these principles out, to lay that out and say, hey, you European countries, you're not going to colonize over here anymore. Keep in mind, they've been doing it since really Columbus, 1492. The U.S. said, basically, the U.S. would not interfere with existing colonies and internal affairs of any European power. So in other words, as long as if they've already got a colony over here, as long as there's a colony over here, we're not going to interfere with that. European powers need to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. That's basically what this thing says. If any attacks or threats are made in the West, we will see this as an attack on the U.S. In other words, if you attack, I don't know, Venezuela, if you attack Cuba, if you attack Mexico, if you attack Argentina, any of the Belize, if you attack, we see that as an attack on the U.S. and we're going to act accordingly. So this is really supported by the British Navy. Most other, and even Britain, look at this in 1823 and just say, whatever, we don't really care. It's not like we made this statement and everybody shuddered and fell into line. Guys, this only gains prominence as we become stronger and stronger as a nation, foreign policy-wise. But for the most part, Britain's Navy supports it, and Britain just says, yeah, whatever. I mean, because we're going to actually get into a conflict with them in American too. We're going to get into a conflict with them in Venezuela in 1895, and we basically save face because Britain got what they wanted, but Britain left. But anyway, this allows for uninterrupted Western expansion of the U.S. Why? Because Russia was over in Oregon, and we have all these other, nations, European nations, looking at maybe, hey, we can colonize out west. Well, what the Monroe Doctrine does is it says, no, that stuff's off limits to you. Russia, you need to leave, and it allows Americans to expand west. Keep in mind, there's people out there, Native Americans. Mexico owns, the California area. So, we get rid of all these other all these other nations like Russia, Britain, who's also interested in keeping Oregon and all this. We get rid of all those, and we can expand uninterrupted. The threat of the Quadruple Alliance is the end of democracy in Latin America. U.S., Britain want free trade. We want freedom of trade. So we don't want an alliance controlling the area. If you look, here's our national debt. I'd like to give you a chart of this as how it goes. But look, in 1825, we're 83.7 million in debt. So it's growing. So expansion, cultural expansion, we're going to talk about this stuff a little bit more in our future notes here. But expansion of public education continues. More patriotic themes arise in literature and art. It's called the Romantic period. The romantic artist, romanticism, and it's basically glorifying American landscapes, American literature, instead of looking to Europe. Here's a population density chart. So if you look here in 1810, you can see how the population, there's not much out here. There's some here, but look at how it grows in this chart 10 years later. So there's the election of 1820. As you can tell, James Monroe, he won pretty much every state except for up here. He didn't get that. But there's one party. There's